Try to pause for a moment and imagine this. Right now, as you sit here, beneath your skin, surrounding your liver, intestines, kidneys, and heart, there are tens of billions of tiny cells working non-stop. They make no sound. They don't perform for you, but they are observing every choice you make each day. What you eat, how long you sit, whether you stand up or not, whether you take a step or remain still. They are fat cells. And if you've ever been taught that fat is something to be eliminated, that your body has betrayed you by storing fat, then today I want you to set that belief aside for a moment. Because the truth is far deeper and far more humane. Fat cells are not the enemy. They are a biological protection system that your body has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to sustain life. When you consume excess energy, they store it. When the world is harsh, they help you survive. When you are ill, they sequester fat so it does not harm vital organs. The problem is not that they exist. The problem is that they have been receiving distorted signals for too long. And what's interesting is this. To correct that signal, you don't need an expensive gym, you don't need exhausting workouts, and you don't need to force yourself into extreme regimens. Sometimes, all the body needs is a very simple, very primitive message. We are moving. 1. When you stand up and begin to walk, at that very moment, a chain of biological reactions is activated. Not after weeks, not when you lose weight, but within the very first minutes, your nervous system shifts state. Your heart rate rises slightly. Blood flow begins to redistribute. The brain sends a signal that the body is leaving a hibernation state. And at the same time, hormones like adrenaline and noradrenaline appear not to create stress, but to awaken the energy system. These hormones seek out fat cells. They knock on the door not with violence, but with precise biological codes. And when that door opens, fat-breaking enzymes are activated. Fat molecules begin to be dismantled, preparing to leave storage. But understand this, your body is not rushed. It does not burn everything immediately. In the first few minutes, you are still using glucose, the fast, readily available energy source. Fat cells are simply listening, like a warehouse being notified that an outbound order is coming. This is the point many people miss. They walk for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, then they stop, and they conclude, walking doesn't work. But what they don't know is this. They left just before the door truly opened. From around the 10th minute onward, the signal becomes clearer. Insulin begins to drop. Blood flows more strongly through fat tissue. The first fatty acids leave the cells and enter the bloodstream. Muscles now ready begin to take in this new fuel. And this is a critically important moment, biologically as well as psychologically. Your body begins to relearn something that was once instinctive. Energy doesn't come only from eating. It also comes from movement. As you continue walking past the 15-minute mark, a deeper shift occurs. Muscles gradually prioritize fat as fuel. Mitochondria, the power plants of the cell, work more intensely. Fat oxidation increases noticeably. This is the phase science calls the optimal fat-burning zone. But I want you to understand it differently. This is when the body begins to trust you. Trust that this movement isn't random. Trust that this isn't a fleeting effort. Trust that it can let go of what it has held onto for too long. And when that trust forms, fat cells don't just release energy. They change their behavior. They become more sensitive to signals. They respond better to hormones. They become more flexible in switching between storage and release. This is especially important in modern life, where many people don't eat excessively, yet still store fat not because of calories, but because the body is stuck in a prolonged defensive state. When you walk regularly, you're not just expending energy. You're reteaching the body that the world is safer than it thinks, that it doesn't need to store for a day that never comes. That movement is normal, not a threat. And the interesting part is this. The effect doesn't stop when you stop walking. After you return home, sit down, drink water when it seems like everything is over inside, the cells continue working. fat breakdown continues. Mitochondria remain more active. The body uses fat to recover, to rebalance. If you do this day after day, what happens is not that you burn fat harder, but that fat no longer needs to exist at the same elevated level as before. Fat cells shrink not because they are destroyed, but because they have completed their task. And when fat cells are healthy, they don't cause inflammation. They don't interfere with insulin. They even secrete hormones that help protect cardiovascular and metabolic health. In other words, you don't need to defeat your body. You only need to communicate with it correctly. And walking, seemingly simple, is actually one of the clearest biological languages the human body has ever understood. There is a paradox that many people fail to notice. The more you try to force your body to burn fat, the more tightly it holds on to fat. The harder you train, the more extreme the restriction. The more tension you carry around each meal, the more the survival system inside tightens its grip. Not because you are weak, but because your body is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect you. In biology, fat does not respond well to force. It responds to context. And the dominant context of modern human life is not simply a lack of movement, it is chronic stress. Stress from work. Stress from finances. Stress from lack of sleep. Stress from constantly feeling not good enough. These states keep cortisol, the stress hormone, elevated. And high cortisol sends a very clear message to fat cells: the danger isn't over. Hold on to energy. That's why so many people eat no more than before, exercise even more than before, yet fat still doesn't decrease. The problem isn't willpower. The problem is a nervous system trapped in defensive mode. And this is where walking plays a role that very few other forms of exercise can. Walking does not threaten the nervous system. It does not trigger the fight or flight response. On the contrary, it sends a primitive signal that the human brain recognizes deeply. We are moving, but not panicking. A state sufficient to expend energy, yet not intense enough to activate survival alarms. When you walk regularly, cortisol tends to decrease. The parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for recovery and balance, becomes more active. And when this internal state shifts, fat cells begin receiving a completely different message than before. No longer, hold on in case of famine, but there is steady movement. There is a stable rhythm of life. You can let go. And only within this context does fat become willing to leave storage cooperatively, rather than being forced out. Another critically important point, well documented in scientific literature, but rarely discussed in daily life, is that walking doesn't just change the amount of fat, it changes the quality of fat. When you engage in moderate intensity movement for a sufficient duration, muscles release a special molecule, a kind of biological message sent to fat tissue. This signal causes white fat, whose primary role is storage, to begin behaving more like brown fat, a type of fat that burns energy to generate heat. In other words, it's not just less fat, but fat that becomes more useful. This explains why some people don't look particularly lean, yet are metabolically very healthy. It also explains why some people see little change on the scale, yet experience reduced waist circumference, increased energy, and more stable blood sugar. The body does not care whether you meet an aesthetic ideal. It cares about biological efficiency. And here is another major misunderstanding that needs to be corrected. High intensity does not equal high effectiveness for long-term fat loss. When you sprint or perform extremely intense HIIT, the body prioritizes glucose because it is the fastest fuel available. This is not bad, but if your goal is to reprogram fat cell behavior, then moderate intensity, sufficient duration, and consistent repetition are what truly matter. The body learns through repetition, not through shock. Each time you walk long enough, you are training fat-breaking enzymes to work more efficiently. You improve blood flow to fat tissue. You enhance the transport of fatty acids into mitochondria. And most importantly, you make this entire system easier to activate the next time. This is why people who walk regularly often feel that their body feels lighter, even without dramatic changes on the scale. That feeling is not subjective. It is metabolic flexibility improving. And that flexibility triggers deeper changes. As fat cells become smaller and healthier, they reduce the secretion of inflammatory substances. They increase the release of protective hormones like adiponectin, an important factor that improves insulin sensitivity and protects cardiovascular health. This creates a positive feedback loop: less inflammation, better metabolism, more stable energy, and less fat accumulation over time. The key point here is this: walking is not a quick, fat-burning solution. It is a solution that rebuilds the relationship between you and your body. Many people fail with dieting and exercise not because they don't try hard enough, but because they are fighting their own survival system. Walking, by contrast, is a form of cooperation. It tells the body that it no longer needs to defend itself excessively, that the world is not as hostile as the nervous system believes. And when the body feels safe, it naturally lets go of what is no longer necessary. If you look back at human evolutionary history, this makes perfect sense. Humans did not evolve to sprint every day. We evolved to walk long distances, hunt, gather, and move continuously in a state of alertness without chronic stress. Our metabolic systems were designed for that pattern of movement. Modern society removed that movement, but kept the stress. And fat, in that context, becomes a consequence rather than a cause. When you walk 30 minutes a day, you are not just burning a certain amount of energy. You are returning the body to a biological context it understands, a context where energy is used steadily, where excessive storage is unnecessary, where metabolism can remain flexible. And most importantly, you don't need to be perfect. You don't need to do it 100% right. The body does not learn through perfection. It learns through sufficient consistency. There is one type of fat the body fears more than any other, not because it looks bad, not because it causes rapid weight gain, but because it places the body in silent danger. That fat is visceral fat. Unlike subcutaneous fat, the kind you can pinch, visceral fat lies deep inside, surrounding the liver, pancreas, and intestines. You don't see it in the mirror. You don't clearly feel it. But biologically, it is the most active and the most problematic type of fat. Visceral fat releases inflammatory substances. It interferes with insulin signaling. It forces the liver and pancreas to function under prolonged stress. And importantly, many people who are not visibly overweight still carry high levels of visceral fat. They are often described as thin but metabolically unhealthy. The issue here is not appearance. The issue is that the body is trapped in a biological loop. When insulin remains chronically elevated due to irregular eating, prolonged sitting, and lack of movement, fat cells receive a very clear signal: do not release. High insulin acts like a locked door, and visceral fat, which is more sensitive than subcutaneous fat, responds very strongly to this signal. You can eat less. You can train harder. But if insulin does not drop for long enough, visceral fat remains. This is where walking makes a strategic difference. Not because walking burns more calories than other exercises, in fact, it doesn't. But because it does, something very few forms of movement do well. It lowers insulin steadily without triggering a stress response. When you walk long enough, insulin decreases gently, but for an extended period. No shock, no strong stress reaction. And it is this window of lower insulin that allows visceral fat to begin to loosen." End quote. Many studies show that visceral fat is particularly responsive to prolonged, moderate-intensity movement, not because it is weak, but because it responds well when the internal environment naturally shifts from storage to use. And this is crucial. Visceral fat does not disappear because you force it. It disappears when its biological role is no longer necessary, when the liver no longer has to process overload, when insulin no longer has to keep fat locked in continuously. When the nervous system no longer sounds the survival alarm all day long. When the body realizes that energy is being used regularly, not merely taken in and stored. In that context, regular walking becomes a system-regulating signal, not a single tool for energy expenditure. And here is a very practical insight that many people only realize after some time. When visceral fat decreases, it's not just the waistline that changes. The experience of living changes. You sleep more deeply. You have fewer unconscious cravings for sweets. You no longer experience midday energy crashes. Your mind feels clearer. This is not a placebo. It is the result of reduced inflammation, more stable insulin, and a brain that no longer has to constantly adjust within a chaotic energy environment. This also explains why many people who previously failed at dieting begin to feel their body cooperate again when they switch to regular walking. Not because they did something radically new, but because they stopped doing the things that forced the body into self-defense. Another point needs to be made clearly, especially for older adults or very busy people. Walking does not require you to psych yourself up. It does not create psychological pressure. You don't have to convince yourself every day that today I must train really hard. You simply put on your shoes and go. That accessibility creates a major biological advantage: consistency. The body does not change because of one perfect workout. It changes because of hundreds of small signals, repeated over and over, all saying the same thing. And walking 30 minutes a day is one of the clearest, most sustainable signals available. Each time you walk, you're not only using fat during that session, you're teaching the body that fat burning is a familiar state, not an emergency situation. And when it becomes familiar, the metabolic system stops resisting. Put another way, you don't lose fat. You regain access to fat. Fat is no longer locked in storage. It becomes part of a circulating energy flow. And when energy flows well, the body no longer needs to store excessively. This is why people who walk regularly, even without strict dieting, can still see significant improvements in metabolic markers. Not because they eat less, but because their bodies process energy more effectively. And this is also where we need to address a very common misconception, that walking is only for beginners, the weak, or those who lack the discipline to train hard. In reality, from a metabolic biology perspective, walking is one of the most mature forms of movement. It doesn't try to impress. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply does what the body needs repeatedly, long enough, and consistently. And when you understand that, you stop seeing walking as not enough. You begin to see it as the foundation. There is a question many people never dare to ask openly, yet quietly carry for years. Why do I always start with so much determination, but then give up? Not only with exercise, but with dieting, healthy living plans, and every attempt at self-change. Every time, the pattern repeats. A highly motivated beginning. Then a few weeks later, everything slows down. Fatigue, self-blame, and finally, a return to the old place, with the familiar feeling of failure. If you've ever been stuck in that loop, I want you to listen carefully to this. The problem is not you. The problem lies in how we've been taught to take care of our health. Most popular approaches rest on an unspoken assumption that people will change if they are pushed hard enough, if the pressure is strong enough, if the goal is frightening enough. But human biology and psychology don't work that way. Our nervous systems do not cooperate well with coercion. When you place yourself under overly rigid plans, the body doesn't interpret that as discipline. It interprets it as threat. And its natural response is resistance through fatigue, cravings, procrastination, and a pullback toward familiar states. Walking, in that context, is not just a form of exercise. It is a remarkably subtle psychological strategy. It doesn't ask you to fight. It doesn't require grand promises. It only asks you to do something deeply human. Move your body through space, at a pace where you can still breathe, still think, still remain present. This very non-threatening quality creates a massive difference. When you walk, you don't have to overcome a major mental barrier. You don't need to prepare yourself the way you would for an intense workout. You don't need special clothing, a gym, or a complex plan. You just need to leave your seat and take a step. And because the barrier is low, the behavior is easy to repeat. In behavioral science, this is the critical point. Long-term change is not determined by intensity, but by frequency and sustainability. A small, low-pressure behavior, repeated consistently, gradually rewires neural maps in the brain. It becomes normal. And when a behavior becomes normal, it no longer requires motivation. This is why so many people begin walking with very modest goals, just to feel less tired, feel less heavy, feel less mentally strained, and then, after a few months, realize they have changed far more than expected, not because they forced themselves, but because body and mind relearned a different rhythm of living, a rhythm with movement, a rhythm with breathing space, a rhythm not centered solely on intake and storage. Walking also creates a very special space for the mind, something rarely discussed in conversations about health. When you walk, especially outdoors, your brain is not bombarded with dense streams of information. It is allowed to wander, to make loose connections, to process thoughts that had no room during the day. Many people call this clearing the mind, but biologically, it is the nervous system self-regulating. And when the mind is less tense, the body becomes less defensive as well. This has a direct impact on eating behavior. When stress decreases, you are less likely to seek sweets for comfort. When you sleep better, hunger-satiety hormones function more steadily. When daily energy no longer fluctuates wildly, you no longer feel the urge to compensate at night. None of this comes from forcing yourself. It all comes from creating the right conditions. And here is a crucial insight. The body changes best when it does not feel judged. Many people enter a health journey with a quiet inner attitude. I need to fix myself. But fixing always carries an implication of being wrong. And feeling wrong always triggers stress. Walking, when approached correctly, does not carry the message, I am wrong. It carries only one message, I am moving. No judgment, no comparison, no failure if today's walk is slower than yesterday's. It is precisely this neutrality that makes walking such a solid foundation for other changes. When the body becomes accustomed to movement, you can add other forms of exercise if you want. When the mind is less tense, adjusting eating habits becomes easier. But without this foundation, many other efforts collapse easily. Another point needs to be made clearly. Walking is not a weak choice. It is the choice of people who understand that real change takes time and requires cooperation with biology. It is the choice of those who no longer want to repeat the cycle of enthusiasm, exhaustion, quitting, and perhaps more deeply, walking is a profoundly human act in the modern world. In a society that encourages you to sit more, think more, worry more, but move very little, standing up and walking each day is a gentle reminder that you are still living in a body, not just inside your head. When you walk 30 minutes a day, you're not just doing something healthy. You are creating a small, regular ritual that tells yourself, I deserve care that doesn't exhaust me. And from that small ritual, many other things begin to change quietly, but durably. There is a very particular moment that most people experience only after walking regularly for some time. It's not the moment the scale drops dramatically. It's not when someone compliments you for looking slimmer. It's something far more subtle. It's the moment you realize your body is no longer fighting you. You wake up without feeling as heavy as before. You eat a normal meal without guilt. You get through a long workday without feeling completely drained halfway through. And most importantly, you stop constantly thinking about whether you are doing things right or wrong. For many people, it's the first time in a long while they feel that their body is on their side. That moment doesn't come from a miracle method. It comes from the internal system finally being placed back into the correct biological context. Energy is no longer locked away. Stress is no longer the default background state. Movement becomes a normal part of life again, not a task to complete. And when you look back, you begin to see something clearly. Many issues you once believed were due to lack of willpower were actually the result of an overloaded system. Your body has spent too long in a state of being both immobile and stressed, a state humans were never evolutionarily designed to endure for extended periods. Fat, in that context, is not a personal failure. It is a survival strategy. When you walk regularly, you are not just burning fat. You are removing the reason fat exists. The liver no longer has to deal with chaotic energy flow. Insulin no longer has to intervene constantly. The nervous system no longer has to stay tense in response to imagined threats. And as these pressures ease, the body naturally shifts into a state of use rather than storage. This is a crucial point to emphasize. The body does not need you to understand all of biology in order to change. It only needs you to send consistent signals. And walking is one of the clearest, easiest signals to understand. Every day you walk, whether slow or fast, whether shorter or longer than planned, you repeat the same message. We are living in a rhythm that includes movement. And biologically, that message is stronger than any promise. Gradually, you'll notice very everyday changes. You no longer rely on coffee to survive the morning. You crave sweets less at the end of the day. You no longer feel the need to let loose on weekends because you've been holding yourself together all week. These changes don't come from iron discipline, but from balance being restored. This is especially important for people who have tried many methods and failed people who carry a quiet belief. I'm just not the kind of person who can stick with habits. But when they start walking and realize they can maintain it without constant inner struggle, another belief appears soft, but deep. Maybe I'm not as undisciplined as I thought. Maybe the problem was never who I am. Maybe it was the method I chose. This is when the health journey shifts from fixing yourself to understanding yourself. And when you understand yourself, you begin making different choices. Less extreme, less all or nothing, followed by quitting. You start choosing things you can live with, long-term things that don't require you to become a different person. In that sense, walking becomes a new standard for every other decision. You start asking, is this as sustainable as walking? If the answer is no, you reconsider. A diet that makes you tense? Probably not suitable. A training schedule that exhausts you? Probably unnecessary. A goal that constantly makes you feel lacking? Probably not what you're truly seeking. Walking teaches a very important lesson that few people state plainly. Progress does not need to be loud. The body does not change through shock. It changes through stability. And within that stability, fat gradually loses its central role. It no longer needs to stand guard, no longer needs to store for a vague, looming threat. It returns to its proper place, a flexible energy source, ready to be used when needed. When this happens, many people realize they no longer need to chase fat loss. Because when the system functions well, fat loss is simply a consequence of more stable insulin, a consequence of reduced inflammation, a consequence of deeper sleep, a consequence of a nervous system no longer stretched tight all day, and perhaps more deeply, a consequence of no longer treating the body as something that must be controlled, but as a system that needs to be listened to and cooperated with. At this point, many people begin asking a very different question than before. No longer, how do I lose fat as fast as possible? But what kind of body do I want to live in for the next 10, 20 years? And the answer is rarely about a number on the scale. It's about how life feels, having energy, stability, the ability to walk without pain, think without heaviness, and exist in your body without constantly fighting it. Seen from that perspective, walking is not an exercise. It is a life choice. A very modest choice, but a very clear one. Choosing movement over numbness. Choosing consistency over extremism. Choosing cooperation over confrontation. And from that small choice, everything else begins to shift. Perhaps at this point, the most important question is no longer, does walking help reduce fat? Because the biological answer to that is already very clear. The more important question is a different one, deeper, quieter. How have I been treating my body all these years? Many people enter a health journey with an unspoken mindset. They must fix themselves, control themselves, defeat themselves. But if you look back at everything we've just gone through, from fat cells, insulin, visceral fat, the nervous system, to behavior and psychology, you'll see a very different truth. Your body has never been fighting you. It has only been responding to the signals it receives. When the signals are prolonged immobility, constant stress, and a disordered rhythm of life, it stores. When the signals are extreme, forced, and violently fluctuating, it defends itself. But when the signals are steady, safe, repeated movement, it begins to cooperate. Walking 30 minutes a day from the outside may not look like anything special, but from the inside, it is a very clear biological message. We are alive. We are moving. We are not trapped. And the body understands this faster than you might think. It doesn't need you to be perfect. It doesn't need you to know every scientific term. It only needs you to be consistent enough to create a new rhythm. Once that rhythm is established, many things begin to self-correct. Fat is no longer the enemy. It becomes energy. Insulin no longer has to strain itself. It gets to rest. The nervous system is no longer in constant alarm. It gets to breathe. And you, perhaps for the first time in a long while, no longer feel that you have to do something to fix yourself. You are simply living in your body more naturally. What's worth noting is this. Many people only realize this after they've tried everything else, after diets that exhausted them, after training plans that made them quit, after blaming themselves for believing they lacked discipline. But when they return to a very simple action, walking, and allow it to happen long enough, regularly enough, without judgment, they realize something essential. Real change is quiet. It doesn't arrive through dramatic breakthroughs. It comes through quiet afternoons when you put on your shoes and step outside. It comes through mornings when you walk more slowly, but you still walk. It comes from not quitting just because today wasn't perfect. And it is precisely these seemingly small moments that the body comes to trust. You may not remember the exact day you started walking, but you will remember the feeling when one day you realize you're no longer as tired as before. You'll remember the moment when your clothes feel less tight, but more importantly, your mind feels lighter. You'll remember the feeling of no longer having to battle every food choice. That's when you understand fat doesn't disappear because you hate it. It disappears because you no longer need it to protect you. And perhaps the deepest message of everything we've discussed isn't really about walking. It's about how you approach everything else in life. Are you choosing things that can be sustained? Are you creating rhythms of living that your body can live with long-term? Or are you still trying to rush the process, then blaming yourself when you can't keep up? Walking teaches us a very simple but very difficult lesson in the modern world. Going slow does not mean going backward. Sometimes it's the only way to go far. If you're at a stage where your body feels heavy, disordered, or simply unresponsive, perhaps you don't need another new method. Perhaps you just need to give your body something very old back. Steady movement. Not to become a different version of yourself, but to return to the version that was designed to function well in the first place. And if today, after watching this far, you do nothing else but stand up and walk for 10 minutes, then this video has done its job. Not because 10 minutes will change everything, but because those 10 minutes may be the first signal of a new rhythm of life, a rhythm in which you are no longer fighting your body. You are simply walking alongside it. If you want to continue understanding the body more deeply, not in a sensational way, not following trends, but grounded in real biology and real lived experience, stay with the channel. What we've discussed about walking will also help you better understand fasting, stress, and why many fat loss efforts quietly damage metabolism. But first, don't think about anything else. Stand up, put on your shoes, and walk. Your body knows what to do next.